There's been an update to the story out of Oklahoma City where Oklahoma City Police Sergeant Joseph Gibson brutally slammed an elderly Vietnamese man named Lich Vu to the ground during an October encounter over a traffic accident. Let's talk about it. What's up, you guys? Welcome back to Southern Draw Law. My name is James White, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, former police officer. So I did a video back in January that was sort of an update, but I didn't actually cover the original case. If you don't remember, Joseph Gibson responds to a traffic accident. Sergeant Gibson develops a theory that the Vietnamese man, I believe, was at fault in the accident. He's trying to go about explaining that. And one thing that I missed in my original coverage of it was that Mr. Vu did actually tap Sergeant Gibson on the chest, but it was more like a, you're young and I'm old and you're going to listen to me. Like, it seemed to me like it was a cultural disconnect more than it was like assault. But under the definition of the law, tapping someone on the chest would be assault almost everywhere, because you're either attempting to get that person to apprehend being touched, or you're touching them in a way that a normal person would find offensive. But nonetheless, the response that Sergeant Gibson ended up having was completely disproportionate. And so, if you remember correctly, he takes him down in this brutal sweep, and Mr. Vu actually hits his head on the ground. Well, KFOR4 had an update to this story that really has some bombshell new details that are coming out. So without further ado, let's go out to the KFOR4 channel in Oklahoma and check out their news story, and then we'll have some things to say along the way as the information unfolds. Let's check it out.
Now to a News 4 exclusive. More big developments surrounding a very controversial Oklahoma City police encounter.
We were the first news outlet to tell you the officer involved has resigned. It comes months after then Sergeant Joseph Gibson took an elderly man to the ground during a traffic stop last October. Police say 71-year-old Lich Vu touched and shouted at Gibson.
This footage is part of a nearly 6-minute video released by Oklahoma City Police in November. But now, the attorney representing Lou's family is giving us never-before-seen footage from the same call.
News 4's John Hayes takes us through it.
The vehicle was not like that.
Sit down.
No.
You sit down. Get on the ground. No, sit.
It's video from a traffic stop we've been showing you for months now. An argument between now former Oklahoma City Police Sergeant Joseph Gibson and 71-year-old Lich Vu over a traffic ticket escalating.
Hey, roll fire and out here and a supervisor. I got into use of force.
But you haven't seen this. Several minutes of new video shows everything Gibson said and did after Vu ended up on the ground. You can see Vu's wife clearly distraught.
Because I'm bleeding. He died.
No, he's not.
No.
Go sit over there.
A few minutes later, things escalate between them.
Go over there.
I need a picture with this.
Go over there.
Yes, sir.
You're about to get sprayed. Go over there now. Go over there. Sit.
Gibson eventually unlocks Vu's handcuffs before another officer shows up.
He still has a pulse, but he hit his head.
Vu's attorney tells us he suffered a brain bleed that required surgery, broken bones, and was already in poor health battling cancer. The second officer is unsuccessful at waking him up at first. Gibson eventually makes a request.
You might check for a pulse. I'm getting adrenaline.
Vu eventually wakes up, but is unable to move much. His wife comes back to check in.
Go over there.
That's my husband.
I understand it's your husband, but you need to wait right there.
Vu is on the ground for about 6 minutes before an ambulance shows up.
Okay, so you can tell by some of the language that he's using directly after this interaction, he actually thinks it's possible that he's killed this guy. And yet he's still so out of control emotionally that he doesn't even want this lady to take pictures. Now, she's offered no threat to him whatsoever. I would make the argument that even in spite of the fact that the victim lightly tapped him on the chest, I don't think any reasonable person or reasonable police officer would have been able to articulate that that's a genuine threat. It was more of like an attempted show of authority than it was a threat. And so he's getting all jacked up and escalated on the wife and threatening to pepper spray her after he believes, he's of the mindset that it's possible this person is deceased. He's not even sure that he's feeling a pulse because of adrenaline still pumping, and he's still threatening to pepper spray her. Now comes the cover-up. And this is the interesting part. When someone does something like this, the way that they act and the things that they do directly afterwards directly implicate what their state of mind was at the time. And so, in my estimation, he's feeling like he really screwed up. And he's starting to try to figure out what he can do to cover his tracks and make it seem like he was more reasonable than he actually was. And did you miss the part where the news station just said that he quietly resigned? Has anybody heard that? Remember that the timeline of this case was that this happened in October. In November, I think it was, the district attorney filed aggravated assault charges on him. And then in January, the Attorney General, Gentner Drummond, swept in and dismissed those cases and took the case out of the jurisdiction of the elected district attorney. Now he's quietly resigned and nothing's happened to him. And now we realize that directly after this incident, he's starting to take some protective measures, but it's going to get worse. So let's continue watching here.
Gibson explains to paramedics what he says happened.
I grabbed a hold of him. He fell. He hit his head whenever he fell pretty hard. There was a knot. Lost unconsciousness. He's bleeding. This guy laying on the ground.
Gibson's supervisor shows up next, but we don't see the conversation.
Talking to Lieutenant Gary, turn the body camera off.
Attorney Devin Jacob plans to sue Gibson on the Vu family's behalf.
Mr. Gibson is not going to be the only defendant.
So, wow. Immediately lies to the EMTs when they arrive to try to render aid to this guy. Do you think there's a difference in the way they might treat the person, thinking that they just fell as a result of poor balance when a police officer grabbed a hold of him? I mean, the way that he framed it made it seem like I grabbed a hold of him and he fell. Well, there's a drastic multiplication of force from a throw or a straight arm lock or whatever the technique was, using all of the momentum that Sergeant Gibson exacted on him and sweeping him headfirst down into the ground. An extreme delta that would have existed in force multiplication from him falling simply because he lost balance after he was grabbed, because ostensibly you would be also trying to catch that fall, right? This is a big, big problem because now he's giving false information. So he's reported false information on camera to the EMTs, which ostensibly would have had some effect on their initial ability to treat Mr. Vu's wounds. We're really very fortunate that we're not dealing with a person who was killed in this particular situation. Let's continue.
That's because Jacob says this is a complex case with many factors, starting with a criminal charge Oklahoma County District Attorney Vicky Behena filed against Gibson for aggravated assault and battery. Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond later dropped the charge, saying Gibson acted within the scope of his training.
There's a question now as to who actually is in charge of setting the training, which apparently Mr. Gibson was complying with when he assaulted and nearly killed my client.
There's also the internal review we were told last year was underway. It could have led to discipline for Gibson had he not resigned.
The information trickled over through the rumor mill, and that's how the family found out.
Police won't share any results or recommendations with us.
They're essentially telling their officers that, it's really bad what if you break the law, but if you get a pass for breaking the law, then we're going to give you a pass and let you slide out of here without any repercussion.
I requested interviews this week with Chief of Police Ron Basie, City Manager Craig Freeman, OKC FOP President Mark Nelson, and former Attorney General Mike Hunter, one of Gibson's attorneys. All of them declined. Nelson, though, sent us a statement Tuesday saying the FOP supports Gibson's decision to resign. Jacob says he's concerned about the lack of transparency.
We're going to find out exactly what happened, and I assure the public that the story is going to be made public, all of it, every detail.
He also has serious concerns about something Gibson could be heard saying.
I grabbed a hold of him, he fell, he hit his head.
Those same words also showed up on the report Gibson filled out.
A police report is an official record, and if you or I, make a false statement to the police, we would be charged with a crime for, making false reports. So again, we need to look at those reports and see if everything contained in those reports was truthful, and if they're not truthful, was it an intentional or an intent to mislead an investigation? Because that's also a question that needs to be answered here.
John Hayes, Oklahoma's News 4.
All right, John, thank you. Now, Jacob also told John while they initially planned to file the lawsuit last month, it's now been delayed to April. He says it's due to citations issued to Vu for assault and a traffic citation he says can't be accounted for.
Jacob says he's under the impression District Attorney Vicky Behena does not plan to file charges for assault, but would like to get that in writing first. As far as the traffic citation, Jacob says he was told by court officials they do not have any record of it being filed.
John reached out to Behena's office for comment, but hasn't heard back yet.
Y'all smell that? That is corruption. Did you take note of what the reporter just said about one of Gibson's attorneys, Mike Hunter, that he's the former attorney general? So let me make sure I understand. Sergeant Gibson is represented by a lawyer who is the former attorney general of Oklahoma named Mike Hunter. And then the current Oklahoma attorney general, who, by the way, if you don't remember, ran on a platform of anti-corruption, swooped in and just, in an unbiased, impartial, and objective fashion, circumvented the authority of the elected district attorney in order to drop aggravated assault charges on a police officer that is now being represented by the person who held his job 6 months ago. Now, that's more than a coincidence, guys. I'm not a conspiracy theorist because I don't have the time or energy for it. But that's more than a coincidence. That's ridiculous. So it's amazing that we are here. And then this guy gets to resign. He's relieved of any threat of criminal charges. And the only hope is that the current administration in charge of the Federal Department of Justice might take an interest in this case and charge him federally under deprivation of rights. Don't hold your breath, because I don't think that's going to happen. That training argument that this attorney is making is the exact thing that I said. I don't know of any training standard that would include that as a necessary component. He didn't even give the guy a command to put his hands behind his back. He didn't say you're under arrest. He didn't do anything except grab him and say no and take him to the ground. His reaction was 100% retaliation. It was not in order to take him under arrest. He did not try to take him under arrest. He simply took the man and used a planet to knock him unconscious. That's it. So remember that under the use of force continuum guidelines, if the suspect is here, you're allowed to go here. You're allowed to go one level above, but it's one level above what is happening at the moment that force is applied. Nothing's happening except a verbal disagreement at the moment force is applied. Force is applied in retaliation to what just happened so quickly that I even missed it when I was reviewing the video in order to do my report on it. So there was no force, no resistance being offered at the time that Sergeant Gibson put his hands on Mr. Vu. That period of force was over, snap and done. That's it. It was done. It would have looked much better had he said to Mr. Vu, and based on the way this thing shook out, Mr. Vu probably would have resisted, but that's not the point. The point is he didn't have a chance to resist because he was never told to put his hands behind his back. He's supposed to intuitively know that the officer he just thought he could smack now has authority over him and he's got to put his hands behind his back. It just doesn't work that way. In closing, you have to remember that politicians say whatever it takes to get elected or to get the job, and then they don't do it. I mean, how many politicians do what they said they were going to do when they get in office? Not very many. And it's very clear based on the fact that Gentner Drummond ran on this platform of anti-corruption that whatever corruption looks like to us is not what corruption looks like to him. I don't know what corruption he's referring to because there's tons of it right under his nose, and he seems to be directly involved in the creation of it in this particular case. So I'm curious what you guys think about this update. My mind was blown by the fact that A, he was allowed to resign, and B, that this Mike Hunter was the former attorney general and is now representing him. And this circumstance that exists that the AG dismissed this case and took it, which is an extraordinarily bold move to undermine the authority of the district attorney elected to that position in that area. It was a very out of the ordinary thing for an attorney general to do. And it should be fairly obvious to anybody looking and paying attention that this is corruption. Anyway, let me know what you think of it, guys. I would like to invite you to join my Substack community. It's the place where you'll be able to interact with me personally. I'm stepping back from the comments to avoid having to have a pacemaker out in these streets just living life. Substack is a newsletter where it's completely free to join, and you'll get some of the stuff that I don't talk about on here. My response to some of the comments, some sidebar discussions that open up as a result of stuff that people say after the video is posted, all of the backstage stuff, and a glimpse of who I am as a person outside of this studio. So please head over. It's free. There are some paid tiers if you're interested in supporting the channel, but there's no obligation. Please remember to like and subscribe and leave a comment on the video. Check out some of the other videos on the channel and leave a comment on there as well. Until I see you again, take care. Always film your interactions with the police and keep your evidence to yourself.